How did first-century followers of Jesus respond to a government that regarded them as dangerous? How could these first Christians honor a Caesar who demanded their worship and killed some of their leaders? The answer comes in a first-century letter to the Romans. This is the land of the Bible, modern Israel. In the first century, a powerful Rome occupied this holy land, as it did the entire region of the Mediterranean. During that time, the Jesus movement began in the capital city of Jerusalem, and then rapidly spread to Roman centers throughout the empire, where thousands of both Jews and non-Jews, Gentiles, were converted. But followers of Christ were soon regarded as a threat to the empire. Even though the growing Jesus movement was committed to nonviolence and goodwill, their message that Jesus was a Lord greater than Caesar created problems, first in the streets of Jerusalem and throughout the empire. To revisit the religious and political problems created by the first followers of Jesus, Day of Discovery's Mark D. Hahn and Jimmy DeYoung have returned to Jerusalem to reflect on a letter written by the Apostle Paul. It was a letter that indirectly challenged the authority of the empire, even as the Jesus movement had first challenged the religious leaders of Israel.
This is the menorah. It's the emblem of the state of Israel. In fact, the menorah and its 7 branches depict the entire history of the Jewish people. It's located here in the governmental center, the part of the city of Jerusalem where the Knesset would be located, the Supreme Court, and other office buildings. Behind me is the Israeli Knesset. The Knesset building itself is in the shape of the tabernacle which the children of Israel had their transportable worship center throughout their wanderings in the wilderness.
Hey, Jim, I thought you told me this was a demonstration. It's not,
I thought the demonstration was gathering.
This is no demonstration. These are school kids. These are tourists coming here.
Well, I was just telling people about the Knesset. You know, the Knesset is the location where all the laws of the land are decided on. Now, there are members of the Knesset from each of the different parties. The secular parties, the religious parties, the liberal parties, the conservative parties. Even members of the Knesset can be of Arab background. The 120 members of the Knesset who indeed set the law of the land for the state of Israel.
You know, with or without a demonstration, Israeli government, Israeli history gives us some unusual perspectives on the whole idea of people's civil relationship to government.
Like no other nation on earth, the history of Israel provides a showcase for studying the relationship between government and synagogue, church, and mosque. The tensions that exist even today between government and Jewish, Christian, and Muslim worshipers are in many ways just a continuation of the tensions experienced by people of faith living in the first century under the heavy hand of the Roman Empire.
And it was during one of those periods of occupation under a foreign power that a man by the name of Paul, a Jewish follower of Christ, wrote an interesting letter. Probably looks something like this. Here's a replica of an ancient letter wrapped in leather. Paul wrote a letter to the Romans, addressed it to the very center of the Roman Empire that was occupying the nation of Israel at that time. And what Paul wrote had some interesting implications about a citizen's relationship to that government. More specifically, Paul taught followers of Christ not only how to relate to one another, but how to relate to their government as well.
Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. Romans chapter 13.
Jimmy and I thought that talking with church leaders in Israel today might give us an interesting picture of how Jewish and Arab followers of Christ are attempting to apply Paul's words to the Romans. One who we knew would speak openly and honestly with us is a Jewish Christian pastor who has a church in Jerusalem, Menno Kalisher.
How do you, as the pastor of a church here in Jerusalem and the congregation, as Christians, how do you live under a Jewish secular government?
Don't forget that when Paul wrote it, Caesar was in control, and he was not godly. Most of his people around him were not godly. So Paul wrote it when it was the hardest time to obey the government. And frankly, Jimmy, we are living in a much better time. My government is not ideal. My government is not ideal, and your government is too not ideal. But will you please write down all the laws of your government which is breaking God's commandments? I'm not saying it doesn't have, but it's minimal. We simply make a lot of smoke on every issue. But in my daily life, I want to be very straightforward. In my daily life, I do not remember entering into a junction where my prime minister and the law says, don't do, and I say, I must do because God tells me. I hardly enter into such conflicts. I don't remember, only one time. It was almost a situation. It was not a situation where some religious parliament members thought to create a new law where I will not be able to share the gospel, not be able to stock New Testament or Christian material, that if I will go into the church, I will have to tell all the Jews out, I can speak about Jesus only to Gentiles. That kind of a law. It was only a law proposal. And in this stage, we gathered all the elders of the churches in Israel, the evangelical churches. And we thought, what do we do should this law will come into effect? And we were encouraged by Acts chapter 4, by Daniel example, by the book of Revelation that speak about do not compromise. Should this law would enter into effect, we decided we will continue as if it doesn't exist. If we have evangelism, we will continue. We are not going to do something to provoke only because of that. No, we will simply continue our daily life as if this law doesn't exist. Like Daniel continued to pray as if this law doesn't exist in Daniel chapter 6. And what would happen if we will need to go to jail because of that? That's the price we need to agree to accept. We are not going to revolt in the streets. We are not going for demonstration or whatsoever. We will pray. We'll simply take it biblically. If the payment is death, may God help us to stand in front of it. If the payment is jail, may God bless us to build a church in the jail. Whatever, we need to accept the consequences. That's what the Bible teaches. I'm not saying it's easy. I speak as if I'm a hero. God, give me power. If something like this will happen, that we will really fulfill what we say, yes? But that's the plan. Frankly, the law is not bad. Most of the law, reaching almost the 100%. I say thank God for that. It keeps the society able to live one next to another. It keeps us not killing one another, not stealing one from another. Thank God that we have these human laws, and thank God we live in time where these human laws are very close to the Bible.
Render therefore to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Romans chapter 13.
Honoring one's government in a land of conflict requires trusting God's provision, and that may be especially true for Arab followers of Christ living in Israel. Nazar Tuma pastors a church in the Galilean town of Nazareth, where Jesus grew up. Though Nazareth today is primarily an Arab community, it lies within the borders of modern Israel. Nazar leads a group of people who want to be good citizens and neighbors in a land where they are both an ethnic and religious minority. And yet they're sincerely attempting to apply the Apostle Paul's words about honoring their government, even an Israeli-led government.
I want God to use me in every way to be a witness for Him. I want the people in my church to learn how can we be better citizens in this country. How can we make this country look better? We have a great role to play. It's not only just living here. we have a great position. God have located us in this spot, in the Holy Land, in Israel today. God have located us here so we can be witnesses for Him. And we will not come against Israel or against the government or against the laws of this country, because at first and in the end, we all are submissive to Jesus' laws. You know, the law of love, the law of understanding. We are to live in peace, and if we live in peace within us, I'm sure we can live in peace within our community, within our country, in this land.
Owe no one anything except to love one another, for he who loves another has fulfilled the law. Romans chapter 13.
Pastor Tuma's views and his obvious concern for his people have deep historic roots. Because his convictions are grounded in the wisdom of the Bible, he's seeking to build on the principles and culture of love that Paul expressed in his letter to the Romans.
Paul talks in Romans 12 about the body of Christ, that all Christians together form one body with different gifts and different functions within the body. And then goes on in chapter 12 to talk about the overwhelming importance of love. Chapter 12, verse 9, your love has to be something that is completely sincere. That's the heading for what follows. Then in chapter 13, verses 8 to 10, Paul comes back and says, love is the fulfillment of the law. It's what it's all about.
The commandments, do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not covet, and whatever other commandment there may be, are summed up in this one rule: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to its neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Romans chapter 13.
Well, this emphasis on love for one another that sort of puts everybody in the same category is again something that would not have been very familiar to the Romans. They could understand people, being nice to each other and finding their appropriate place in society and so forth. But when we talk about sacrificial, self-giving love for others, that's a new idea that would have seemed to the Romans not only odd, but potentially revolutionary. What happens to the stability of society if masters are supposed to love their slaves? You can see how revolutionary ultimately that kind of principle is going to be for society.
Let love be without hypocrisy. Abhor what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love, in honor giving preference to one another. Romans chapter 12.